Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our March installment of the History Speaker Series. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that I am thankful for the opportunity to honor and recognize the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity. Before we go any further, I must also thank Marianne Grant and OMAH's History Committee, without whom these events would not be possible. And I also want to thank Phil Jackman, who designs the amazing posters that you're seeing within the presentation tonight. Now I'm going to introduce the folks who you are seeing on screen. We have Monica, who is running the Zoom this evening. We have Trish, who is the head of the History Committee. We have our speaker, who I will introduce momentarily. And I am Lindsay. I'm the History Programming Coordinator at OMAH, who has the good fortune to work with all these fine folks. And now it is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, John Savage, who will hopefully be joining us on screen momentarily. John, I have had the pleasure of working with actually several times at OMAH, including I was able to interview him about his ancestor, Antoine for one of our previous exhibits, Welcome Home to Aurelia, which was about immigration. And it's always such a pleasure to work with John because his passion for history and genealogy is just so utterly infectious. John is an amateur historian, storyteller, and a descendant of Aurelia's first settler family. There he is. And he has worked with OMAH before as a co-curator on the exhibit Minjickening, Mapping the Life of the Gadors, and as a presenter on last year's bonus installment of the History Speaker Series called Let the Fur Fly, which you can view on our YouTube page. Currently, John is working as a library consultant, and he endeavors to promote the revitalization of Indigenous encampment spots, trails, portages, and paddling routes. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, John. Take it away. Sorry, John, you just got to unmute yourself there.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. So I do want to also acknowledge that Aurelia is on the traditional territory of my Métis ancestors, who are also Anishinaabe, so I guess that counts. So, Aurelia is also known as one of the largest Métis communities in Canada, actually. So, anyway, that's part of the presentation. I'm going to be looking at this presentation from a Métis perspective of my family, but also as somebody who has lived as an adult in Aurelia and vacationed there and came up there quite frequently as a boy. So my family's roots are deep into Aurelia. Like many of you, you probably can feel the ancestors speaking to you and the stories of Stephen Leacock. And if you do any archival research, it's really quite fascinating to look up the history of the town. And these days as a librarian, what's really cool these days is because I wasn't able, because of Omicron, to get down to Aurelia to do some research that I was hoping. You can do a lot of research online now. So this presentation relies a lot on my own library, but also online resources that I was able to pull together. So this is a bit of, to put this into context, this is a bit of history, but it's also a lot of artifacts. So it's like a museum exhibit of sorts. And I thought I'd share with those images with you in a rapid session towards the end. So the first part, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the importance of logging, and here we go. So why logging? Well, logging is something that we discussed in Let the Fur Fly last summer. We talked about the first 250 years of the fur trade that gave rise to what became Canada. And as we saw from the fur trade, that was an exploration of Canada. It helped to define the boundaries of Canada. So at least to the, in all directions, except to the south, of course, because the War of Independence and the War of 1812 defined those boundaries. What I wanted to focus on was the fact that the lumber trade was important to Canada as the fur trade went into decline. And as the fur trade declined, which was around the mid 1850s, and that coincided with that was sparked by an incident in which Prince Albert showed up at a social occasion wearing a new silk top hat. And based on that, beaver felt went out of fashion and people wanted silk. So there was a great decline in the demand for beaver pelts, and other furs became harder to get, also with overtrapping. So that was an industry that was on the decline at the same time that lumber was starting to increase in importance. And at that time there was the Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s, early 1800s, and that meant that Britain couldn't get their lumber from the Baltic states, so they were starting to bring over lumber from British North America. And this, so what would happen is you would have these logs going over, or lumber going over to Britain, and the return ships coming with bricks in their holds as ballast, and they would then sell that off over here. Some towns, such as Kincardine, have yellow bricks, and that's because those ships were trading in an area of England that had yellow bricks. So if you go down to certain parts of Aurelia and you see yellow bricks, that's what that's from, because that was the particular color coming from that area. Now, now the other thing that was interesting around that time is that there was a great demand for lumber coming out as pioneers. So, you know, as soon as Europeans came to what became Canada, whether it was Champlain or the people afterwards, people needed to build structures, and they would do this out of wood. And of course, and so they would have a lumber trade that was basically a local lumber trade. So you may have some lumber people in town, and people would make boats, and they would make houses out of these trees that were everywhere. And the trees were seen as kind of a nuisance in some ways, because you would want to clear some land to have your town site. So they were all over the place, and logging helped to clear settlement sites as well. Now, one thing I'd like to really stress is the logging era can be characterized as a major transformation of this region of Aurelia. It was characterized as a major industry development in that it was the change of a landscape, you know, with clear cutting. You see the landscape being cleared and opened up. And so it was the replacement of a landscape that had existed for thousands of years, since the Ice Age. And it was also represents the replacement of an indigenous economic way of life and social way of life in balance with the landscape as well. So although fur trading had an impact on the animals, it had less of an impact on the natural landscape that one would see. Whereas with the lumber industry or the logging industry, you just see with the clear cutting and the sites being cleared, the landscape took a major change. This eventually, as we see later, and we'll discuss in this slideshow, you started to see clear cuts becoming areas where there was soil erosion, degradation, dust storms, sandstorms, sand drifting, and dried up stream beds in the summer. And so it was really a major trauma to the landscape, one can imagine. And you would also imagine that anyone that grew up seeing the landscape in its natural state that it had been for centuries and thousands of years, to in one generation see it completely deforested, must have been very traumatic. I remember stories of my own grandfather talking about how his father and him would go down to see a moose that was hunted. This would have been around 1920s, early 1920s. And my great grandfather suggested that might be the last moose that young Joe might ever see in his lifetime, simply because the habitat had been destroyed so much by that time. So anyway, I also wanted to mention that with this destruction of the landscape, the replacement of a way of life, which was living off of the land in a way that would harvest nature in balance, there was also a destruction of, or an erasure of, the indigenous infrastructure of the land. So even though the woods, some accounts talk about how the woods was empty and it was in a complete savage state, pardon the pun, it actually was, the woods was actually a place where indigenous people had built some infrastructure. So let me try and see if I can get this slide to move down a bit. Oh, I don't know what's happening here. Oh, here we go. I just click. Okay, so I put some slides up here to discuss this a little bit. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, okay, here we go, is that Aurelia had always been occupied by different waves of indigenous peoples through thousands of years. And some people believe that, archaeologists today believe that the archaeological, or that indigenous people were here even thousands of years before. Now, when Champlain came to the area, he witnessed that the Wendat, or the Hurons, an Iroquois nation, they were already farming in the area. They had villages, including one up by West Warminster that was used by them. I think there was about 5,000 people, Kayage, 5,000 people living there, and there were various villages all over Aurelia. Some people believe that there could have, estimates are between 30 and 60,000 people living here. So I guess according to sociologists, or that would constitute a civilization if they're in a permanent state. And they would have used the area for hunting, fishing, and forestry as well. You have to remember things like birch bark canoes are found in the forest. It's a special kind of tree that you have to go harvest, special size and a certain microclimate, according to canoe builders that I know. The other thing to keep in mind is that the forest also is a place for gardening. They would create these forest gardens that they could have different plants and bushes, and for berries and such, and these would grow in balance with one another. And the interesting thing these days is that these archaeologists working with ecologists are finding these little forest garden patches all over the Chippewa territory in different places where the landscape hasn't been completely destroyed. And they're finding these out west as well in the Pacific. So it's a new area of archaeology that's quite fascinating, I find. And it's giving rise to a certain kind of agriculture that some operators are actually trying out. So, but what's interesting is these forest gardens, quite often, they're over 100 years old. So they were planted a long time ago. And when these ecologists go through the woods and they find them, they notice that there's a high concentration of a diverse amount of flora. And this, at first, initially, they were wondering why this is. And then they worked backwards and realized that this was actually part of the ecology, or the forest. The other thing that indigenous people used to do was burning. So they're recognizing this more out west, where they're having a lot of these wildfires. They would burn the undergrowth, and that would influence the growth of hardwood trees. So when Europeans first came to North America, they noticed in some areas wide open hardwoods, and without Indigenous people there, they were wondering why this was. But it seemed to make sense because, you know, some of the theory is that the pestilence would have raced ahead of the explorers and would have wiped out a lot of the Indigenous people. There could have been 10 million at the time. And, you know, by the time their bodies decayed and went into the ground, these explorers and settlers would come to these areas and notice these wide open forests where you could hunt big game. And they also supported things like passenger pigeons, which I'll get into later. Excuse me. So anyway, as far as War of the Woods, the theme I have here is there was conflict. There was a little bit of war, maybe, but there was a lot of cooperation too. So anyway, I don't want it to sound like it's all war and there was no cooperation. Of course, there's cooperation, and that's what built the industry and built our society that we have today. But it did influence economic development, social networks, and military alliances that were also broken at the same time. And what this led to was today's managed forest in Simcoe County. So anyway, as I alluded to, there was a war of Indigenous land use practices. And again, we go back to Wendat farming practices with the three sisters, squash, corn, and beans. They all grow very nicely together. That was a traditional crop. There is some areas where the Hurons down around Toronto were growing corn crops that were as large as the present day downtown of Toronto. They were that large, and trading with the Iroquois to the south. Maple sugar harvesting, which is still done today in the Aurelia area, was impacted, of course, by this logging. And there was also the, as I mentioned, the burning of underbrush and these things called deer fences, which I'm showing you here with this little illustration. And this was this deer fence. They could run 5 kilometers and more even, would direct the deer and other big game towards to deep water crossings in the river. And that's where the hunters may set up a blind and attack them in the water. So this is quite interesting because it also fits with the fish weirs of Magickaning down at the what we call now the Atherley Narrows. And these fish weirs that were there, and they were almost a navigational barrier of sorts when they were fully operating. They would actually, that's interesting because as a navigational barrier, it diverted the canoes to portage across the Narrows, which is between Moose Beach and what's called Smith's Bay today, but used to be called Goodore Bay, because that's where my ancestors first settled there, Mary Schilling and Antoine Goodore. Mary was the chief's daughter. So with forestry, as you have log booms being moved through the Atherley Narrows, these would either destroy them or they'd have to be pulled up as the channel there was dredged. So again, getting back to passenger pigeons, in keeping with Jill Price's theme of let the fur fly, I thought I'd mention the fact that logging had an incredible impact on different kinds of wildlife, and perhaps no more so than the passenger pigeons that relied on beech trees and oak trees. And now this is an image I got from a museum online down in California, so I believe it's copyright free. So anyway, but this gives you a really good understanding of what the passenger pigeon's habitat looked like. It looks a lot better to me than one of those pictures of a stuffed passenger pigeon in the museum that we've sometimes seen. Now, interesting thing is there's a group trying to bring back passenger pigeons by taking the old DNA out of the old stuffed ones and combining it with modern day pigeons. So we'll see if that can work. But that'd be really cool if they could bring it back. But, you know, going back to my ancestors' stories again, my great-grandfather told my grandfather that in his day as a boy, he remembers when the skies could be blacked out by passenger pigeons flying across the Narrows. And so within his lifetime, he saw their extinction, which is quite something to imagine, you know. Now, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the beginning of logging in the early period. So right after the War of 18, or the Napoleonic Wars, we have the development of logging in this area. And the logging started right around, the first sawmill was the Coldwater Mill. And I have something printed here, hold on one sec. Okay, well, anyway, the Coldwater Mill was started as an economic development project. And one thing we know about people from Rama is they're entrepreneurs today. They're known as being one of the most entrepreneurial bands in Ontario. And they started at a very early stage of economic development. Their Indian superintendent determined that to help them adapt to settlement coming into the area, that they should build a mill. So they built a grist mill and they built a sawmill for the Coldwater Narrows Reserve. And so that was people under John Asins, and it was also under, I hope I get his pronunciation right there, but also under Chief Yellowhead and Chief Big Shilling, my ancestor there. So this mill was an economic development opportunity for the Chippewas to adapt to the settler way of life. And it was an attempt to see if they could work in a building like this, and to sort of take them away from hunting and gathering and more towards European style economic activity. One can imagine that the story goes that they didn't last too long in this mill, that they gave it up as soon as the hunting got better again. One can only imagine that after a year or two of working in a mill like this with all the dust and the lack of fresh air, you would probably yearn to go back to hunting like your ancestors had and what you're accustomed to. So adapting, switching over to European economic form of work would have been probably pretty difficult, one could imagine. So you got to have empathy for that. The interesting thing about this mill was sold in 1836 after the reserve was sold off, and which they didn't get their money till 2018, I believe it was, just a few years ago in a settlement case with the government. So that's another story altogether. Now the thing about this mill is that it was built by Jacob Gill, who was a loyalist who came up from New York State, who was his daughter ended up marrying Mary Schilling's son. So they and their son ended up being Jacob Gill Gador, the world rowing champion. So the other mill that was built, related to most closely related to Aurelia, was built again by Jacob Gill in 1834, and it was at Marchmount. Now, if you ever get a chance to go up to Marchmount, I would highly recommend it. There's an old mill that you can see in this photograph at the far end. That's a grist mill. So the one in the foreground is the replacement of the sawmill that would have been located a few meters closer to that dam behind there, where it could have had it generated. This mill in the photograph is a steam mill, and I presume it's no longer there. But you can go check it out. It's probably worth a nice drive through the countryside. And so anyway, that's the mill that was built for Chief Yellowhead and his band, that were located down at where Couchijing Park is today. When the reserve was sold off, they did assert that they still own this mill. What we saw was this is kind of highly suspicious behavior, is that it seems that the Indian superintendent would build these mills and then lease them out or sell them off to white settlers. And one has to wonder if there is some sort of kickback in it for him, because it seems like they sort of gave it up pretty quick, because the Chippewas didn't approve of this kind of transaction, and they objected to it strongly. Chief John Asens, for example, forcibly seized the mills up at Port Severn, and that caught the attention of not just the Indian agent who had disapproved of that, but it also caught the attention of Lieutenant Governor Francis Bondhead and his military advisors, because what followed after 1836 was the rebellion of 1837. So this is the conflict, the war part that we needed in this presentation to make it a real war. I just wanted to suggest that the reason, there's an excellent paper that I read on this from an academic who said that, you know, the reason why the indigenous people, in this case it was the Chippewas, were recruited to fight in or to maintain law and order in the rebellion of 1837 was because they were trustworthy. In Aurelia, we had a lot of these rebel types. They might still be there today. I think they evolved into what we call liberals and grits today, although they could be conservatives too, depending on your leanings. These people were sympathizers to the rebels down in Newmarket and Holland Landing. So the indigenous people were considered to be more trustworthy as allies. So it was like rock, scissors, paper. All these different groups sort of conflicted a little bit with one another. They had competing economic interests, and the colonial administrators had betrayed the Chippewas a number of times. So you would wonder, why would the Chippewas agree to go defend the British crown down at the rebellion of 1837? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, they had their guns were taken away from them, so they couldn't do hunting anymore. This was probably an attempt by them to try and get the Chippewas to work in these sawmills instead of going out and living off the land as they were. So the Chippewas wanted to get some guns. They thought joining the rebellion of 1837 was one way of doing it. The other thing too is they thought it would strengthen goodwill. So the fact that they had their sawmills removed and they were still being contested, they wanted to have better bargaining capabilities with the Indian superintendent. So they thought if they could curry favor with the military, this would maybe help with their negotiation later on. Now, just as a quick aside, my cousin Diane Goodor, Jake Goodor Jr.'s daughter, found that some documents detailing the pay list. And here we have on this pay list for 1838, Chief Nebenonnequit, highlighted in yellow, was one of the chiefs who contracted different warriors to go down and to occupy Holland Landing in the winter of 1838 and 39. The year before, his grandson, Francis Goodor, worked with Gerald Alley to bring down 700 Chippewas to occupy that area, much like perhaps the truckers came down to Ottawa here and harassed us. So anyway, I guess that there's a long tradition in Canada of people going down and occupying others' communities. It's not a very nice thing when it happens to you, but anyway, the Chippewas were a good force for that. Here, I also, for my family members tuning into this, Antoine Goodor's name is also listed as one of the warriors, which was probably a natural thing for him to do because he was adopted, one would imagine was adopted into the extended family. He lived, by that time, he was living he was living in the Narrows at that time, but he later actually moved to Rama right there. So there's Antoine. So again, the Chippewas were betrayed of sorts by the military. Sir Francis Bondhead and his team there, instead of employing them for the full winter, basically thought they could save some money and have them go home in the middle of January, which actually was a problem for them because they had already been distracted from their hunting, and they had that would mean that they'd have to go straight back to hunting and their families would starve. So they negotiated a deal, but I don't believe they got any guns out of that deal. So again, betrayal, which meant that they were forced to go into logging, a lot of them. So anyway, one of the interesting things about logging is it was a boom industry. There were over 100 mills in Severn County alone, and they were spread all over the place. And there were big mills and small mills. This is an example of a small mill, small sawmill near Penetanguishene. And there were some great artists that were going around and illustrating these. So the other thing that was interesting it was a source of migration from other parts of Canada. So I'm living in Point Gatineau. I know this was a huge lumber operation here. And some of these people probably ended up down there. Port Severn is an area known for a lot of Quebecois log drivers that first started working in the field, but then started working the mills. Then we see mills all around Aurelia taking shape, such as in Washago here. Here's a beautiful little one. And there's Mill Island is still there today. I remember I had to do real estate appraisal there. Homesteaders, they needed again, lumber to build things. So this is 1844, and you see that shanty there, flat roof with the logs there. You'd have to cut your windows out, and if you cut windows out, then you'd have to have lumber that was planed. So I like including these images because, I don't know if you get to see these too often, but these are digital images from the Toronto Public Library's digital archive. So it's really beautiful to see. But what this image shows is how dense the forest behind there is. And it's mixed of primarily conifer here, but there's hardwood as well in other areas. And again, this is just off the Coldwater Road, I believe. Nope, this is actually Aurelia. So this one is Coldwater Road. You see that little dirt trail there. So I think it was 1.5 miles on either side was the Indigenous or the Chippewa Reserve. And this was an ancient First Nation trail that was then turned into this dirt road and then turned into the highway that we have today. Again, there's Aurelia. And here's a little, so that's called squared timber, and that was cut out for a culvert, and you see the logs there. And this is called a corduroy road. My grandfather said that out in Aurelia, there used to have this corduroy road that would run along when he was a boy, and it would flood in the spring, and sometimes your feet would get wet, but it was better than sinking down into the mud. So anyway, that's quite an image. And it's kind of neat that it's a memory of mine through my grandfather. Now this is, again, this is another image of Aurelia. So this was a lawyer named Titus Herbert Ware who did these beautiful little watercolors. And can you imagine, can you imagine where that might be in Aurelia? So. And again, this is Mona Cottage on Lake Couchiching in Aurelia Township. I don't know exactly where that might be, but it could be, you can see sort of the faint outline of what would be the lake. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about was the Indigenous Forestry aspect, which we discussed earlier. Just the fact that, the woods was a place where they would find materials for building all sorts of things. The wigwam would be built out of spars and out of birch bark with cedar to tie them together. My cousin Desange, who's an artist, his other name is Paul Schilling. You may know him down at different art fairs. What a beautiful artist and writer he is. and he has a sweat lodge. If you ever get a chance to go to his sweat lodge, I highly recommend it. And he builds this little wigwam out of cedar and cedar roots as twine to stitch it all together. And so it's good to see the practice is still there. And here we see the kind of wigwam perhaps that my ancestor Francis Godor would have been born in 1819. So again, here's Rama, and you see this is Rama before logging, you know, and this is Rama after. So Rama's being clear cut at this point. So within the lifespan of one person, you can see the landscape just changing very quickly. And again, here's another picture of Rama. There they are cooking, the little tables, everything they need is right there, accessible from the woods and from their range. And there's a color picture of that Rama scene. Now, the other thing that's interesting I found with logging is this conflict between Indigenous people and settlers. Logging cleared a lot of land. Later we'll talk about how the railway came in and opened it up to settlers. These settlers were then sold land by the government or the Canada Company, which was kind of like the Hudson Bay Company. They were granted all this land that they sold off to settlers. And this land would be sold off throughout their hunting territory as shown by all these circles here. Those are the hunting territories throughout much of Muskoka and to the north of Muskoka, even up towards Sudbury and Killarney, Ontario, or French River area. And these areas, these people would go, these hunters would go to their winter hunting grounds by canoe through these circuitous routes. And quite often these routes could be blocked by fallen trees, if it was log jams, or they would get there and they'd find settlers with guns that would chase them off the land. And that would be the end of their hunting. So anyway, this is again some of the routes, and we see it down here. And so anyway, with all the sale of land, it really expedited the change of the land, of their living off the land. My grandfather told me that he remembers seeing the paddlers, the hunters, going all the way up from Georgina Island. They'd be paddling single file all the way up, and from all the way up Simcoe through the Atherley Narrows, and then up towards the Severn River and Oswego as well. So in 1923, to overcome that problem, that conflict, the Ontario government came up with the Williams Treaty, or it was negotiated on behalf of the Ontario government, and it was like a done deal. There was no negotiation with the Chippewas. They weren't fairly compensated for the land that they lost, as you can see down there, $25 per person, and a paltry amount to the community. This treaty wasn't over until 2018, when they had to go to court a few times to get it a settlement. So, but you know, it had a major impact on that community, and it really did. It forced them into logging, basically. So there you go. Now here's a picture of in 1875 of Aurelia as it looked back then, and you see two logging or lumber operations on either side of the bay there. In the middle is would be Mississauga Street and the pier there. So to the left is Andrew Tate, owned that one, and to the right is the Sutherland Mill. So these are, and then you see right behind it, perhaps, oh yeah, you see the railway there. So that you'd have the Northern and the Midland Railway intersecting in Aurelia as well. And what you don't see is a little island called Cedar Island, which was previously called Pumpkin Island, but when it got filled in with cedar sawdust, I guess, and other debris, it became Cedar Island. And that island is, yeah, it was enlarged by cedar. So that's an effect of logging on the urban landscape. And here's Sutherlands Oliver and Sutherland's planing mill and lumberyard, which I extracted from the archives of the Aurelia Museum of Art and History. And I deduced that through different research that they said it in the archive that it was demolished, but through another source it says it actually burned down. So that would have been, so this picture would have taken place before the burning down, and so anytime between 1868 and 1871. By the time the Midland Railway came through, it would have gone through this property, I suppose. But you can see faintly in the background the logs floating around in the bay there. So I'm going to focus briefly on Longford Mills as an example of logging, because it directly impacted my Rama relatives there, or ancestors. So one thing that's interesting is 20 to 25 20-ton railway cars a day would be loaded up and shipped out of Longford Mills. And at that time, it was just in the bush. So here we have one of the key people in Longford Mills. It was John Thompson. And he, as a young man, he enlisted the help of John Young, an old Chippewa man who helped him to assess the property that was up for sale. And he was able to determine pretty accurately what its potential was. And he went and bid in an auction $30,000 for all this, the woods, which was heavily populated by pine and hardwood. So some of there's just an incredible amount of lumber that was hauled out of there. And he employed up to 250 locals. Because he was close to Rama, one would suppose that he hired a lot of settlers and Indigenous people. A lot of farm laborers, white farm laborers, found that the pay was really good north of Barrie in the Aurelia area. So they did make good money in the fields. And then in the wintertime, they would go to the lumber camps and do quite well, because there's very little you could spend your money on in the bush there. Holed up in one of the logging camps. So this fellow, well respected in the community, when he passed away suddenly at the age of 50, everyone came out and they made a special note how many Chippewa people came out to pay their respects to him as well. So it seems that there was a lot of cooperation among these mill owners and the Indigenous people as well. And that was good to hear about. Not just him, but there was another fellow, Al McPherson, who also ran an operation close to Geneva Park. So this map shows the Longford Mills catchment area. The highlighted yellow is where the logs would come from and where they go. And you see the Black River and the Head River were a source. And then they come down this canal that was carved out by a consortium. John Thompson was one of them, and a couple others. And then on the north end, where there's a little bit of yellow shading, that's the tramway, which I'll show. So today, this is what the site looks like. That's the site where the mill was, but now it's, what, a chemical plant or something? And I'm not sure, but you can check it out. And it's just right close to Rama. I've never been there, but now I'm going to go check it out. Again, here's a close-up of that, an explosion of that map there, and you see in the top, the tramway, top left, to Portage Bay, where the old YMCA summer camp was that I went to with a bunch of juvenile delinquents. And then to the right is the Black River, Lake, and St. John Canal that would link it up. Now, the interesting thing is why they had the canal there is because the water level would rise. Normally, the water flows from the St. John River down to the Black River. It flows out of Lake St. John, but in the spring it reverses. And it reverses because the Black River can be much, much higher in water level than Lake St. John or even Lake Couchiching. Sometimes it would flow over the lowlands there into Lake Couchiching. So basically a village evolved around the mills. Here we see a boarding house. The married people would have homes. The logging camps were pretty rustic. In some logging camps, you would have two men sharing a bunk with one blanket, which would be pretty cozy in the winter time. But you would imagine by springtime you get kind of fed up with that and want to go to town and party. So anyway, here's some more images. I'm just going to now go quickly through the different images. Here's it looks like a little lumber camp there down in the valley with a lot of denuded trees. Probably the dead ones were left standing, and they would harvest the good ones. So it's getting to be a barren landscape. Here's it was pretty social in a way. You'd have lumber kings bringing their friends up, and they do hunting parties as well. Pretty collegial. And again, here's a better map showing the proximity of things to one another. Okay, so here's an image of just up on the Black River, where the Black in the bend there, you'd have different lumber mills, lumber companies with their stamped logs directing them through the canal, and sometimes they would come to fisticuffs over who had priority. So that's a bit more conflict right there, and there's a massive amount of lumber there. This is an interesting piece of transportation infrastructure. It's called the logging tram, and it would, at 2 miles an hour, would cart individual logs over to Lake Couchiching, where they would then be by tugboat brought to Aurelia, or they could be brought down to Beaverton to be shipped out by railway from Beaverton on the Midland Railway, or they could be taken down to Jackson's Point around Barrie, and there's another sawmill down there as well. And as they would be pulled through the narrows, could get stuck in the mud there. A lot of the logging ended up in the mud at the bottom of the lake. Here again is another Lake St. John image, and you can see the faint outline of maybe the tramway there down at the far end. And what also happened was with logging is the railways, as Stephen Leacock said, the railway spread like a running grapevine over Upper Canada. So the race to reach Aurelia was won on November 14th, 1871, with the Northern Railway beat the Midland Railway to Aurelia. And they diverted their route from going up the west side of Lake Couchiching to going up the east side, because they wanted to get the business from Longford Mills. John Thompson wouldn't give him his business, wouldn't give the railway business for a year or two, until he was a special visit from the railway, the head of the railway, on the pretext of him going up hunting. He stopped off for a friendly chat, but John Thompson said, if you want to talk to me, you come to my office. So they eventually worked out a good deal, and there was a lot of lumber that was hauled out of there. And there's a picture of the Longford Mills operation. You see the railways there, and then the lumber yard. That's a lot of work. And there's my grandfather. So I believe my grandpa probably worked down there, I suspect. He told me about it. I used to be into weight training, and he said, you know, you're not that strong compared to, you don't know what real hard work is unless you worked in a lumber camp, John. You would be just loading and unloading lumber 10 hours a day. By the end of the day, your arms are ready to fall off. And that's the reason why I became a camp cook instead, he said. So he told me that story just a few years before he passed away. I thought that was really quite interesting how he became a camp cook. But it seems like various generations of Goodors worked in the bush, including Jake Goodor, and he was known to have developed his fine physique that he then parlayed into a professional rowing career. He built that up in the bush, working hard. And but I guess he found too, you know, that it would be a lot easier to train to become a world champion rower than to work in a logging camp. So a few of his brothers joined him in professional rowing. His most notable brother was Charles, my great-grandfather, who also was a wrestler, a professional wrestler as well, and also became North American rowing champion in the 1 mile sprint. So here's a note of the different people that work for Alan McPherson, and one of them highlighted as Goodor. Some of these are also relations of mine and people that also work, or also people from Rama, one would assume. So this proves that there was a number of Indigenous people like Big Win and Schilling and Jordan, or Peter Jordan as well, who would, and Snake probably would have been working there. So the economic development integration was fairly complete. They had their own farm there. And again, I mentioned the railways, and they also had steam tugboats that would impact. Now, the impact on Aurelia was after John Thompson died, his widow and his son moved to this house called Longford Villain. And this was on 42 Nawash Street. And it's still standing there, so that's worth checking out. And there's another one called Glenmora, which was Andrew Tate, owner of the Tate Cars Lumber Company. The interesting thing about this house is they said that from the tower he could keep an eye on his operation. On the third floor there was a roller skating floor for his kids to be occupied. And now the other interesting thing about the Tate Cars Lumber Company is that they eventually got into making what they call Mackinac jackets. And so you see this one, although pretty cool garment here. That was made, these were made for the lumber, the guys in the field there. So they eventually morphed into a fashion garment company as well. So anyway, the other aspect that affected Aurelia was that when the loggers came to town, it would just go crazy. These guys may be in the bush from November through the springtime, through the spring log rush. And when they get to the town, they would have all this money in their pocket because there was no place to spend it. And after spending several months bunked up with another guy with one blanket, you just go nuts. So, you know, why not go drinking and whoring and fighting and all the other things? Apparently there were gangs of people that would fight it out. And, you know, living in Ottawa, Gatineau, our logging era ended just like 30 years ago. So a lot of people here tell me about all the fighting that they used to do as well, even in modern times. My neighbor pulled out a number of bodies out of the river of people that got stabbed from fights at the bars and the illegal gambling clubs up and down the river. So yeah, that would have been crazy. So there was a reaction against that. Two reactions. One was temperance. So there were laws passed to try and curtail drinking and the sale of alcohol, which was kind of a fun way to get around those rules. There was lots of rum running and or alcohol running back and forth. I remember doing work for a fellow up in Mill Island as a very old man, and his wife told me that he used to work with his teacher. She was a young woman, and together they would run alcohol in and out of Aurelia illegally. So it also brought in a bit of class conflicts. So you had the wealthier class, the merchant class, resenting these loggers that would come to town and tear the town up. So, you know, there's pressures on both. And so that, you know, I always wonder, like, Aurelia does have a bit of a hierarchy in terms of social classes at times. And I noticed my own grandmother was very concerned with the appearances of her house and such. So maybe that was partly about how you try and differentiate yourself by maintaining a certain manner of dress and the way you kept your home. Okay, so here I wanted to show this image here because it shows a teepee in the middle and the shanty. So this is a good example of how both Chippewas and settlers were working together in the logging trade. And logging stimulated other industries that diversified the economy, such as the E. Long Manufacturing Company that built a lot of sawmill machinery, as we see here. There was the Tudhope car manufacturing, which I don't have a slide for, but that was developed there. And then there was all the supporting industries. The TD Bank was one of them. The TD Bank located to Aurelia to get the business of John Thompson and his sawmill company. And also these boats. So there's a transportation network. So you had a lot of the ferries that were coming to Aurelia, and they would take people out. There's new wealth that were created. It kind of laid the foundation, I think, for Stephen Leacock's Mariposa, which was kind of a nice, quaint little village with the kinds of conflicts you might have imagined coming out of this kind of scenario. And here in the end, you see vast tracts. Now, I got this slide from the Simcoe County Forest video. It's a beautiful video, or it's about 14 minutes. It's well worth seeing on YouTube. And so here we see the desolation, the Hendry tract, which became the focus for tree planting. So I'm not going to go into that because I don't have time, but that's a fascinating story, well worth seeing. So just to summarize what happened in the post-logging era is, a lot of this created dust storms, sandstorms. So you had to have these county forests to repair it. They were funded by government money. They'd pay to the landowners to develop and manage these forests for them. It's became a leading county forest system that became shared a lot of best practices throughout Ontario. My cousin Frank Keogh, I had a really nice conversation with him. He is perhaps one of the last logging people. His dad was a major logger, and he bought and sold lumber to the Midland Railway Company for their ties. When that went under, because the Midland Railway Company wasn't a very well-run company, and there's a lot of people trying to scam others, he ended up owing a lot of money to his suppliers. So he got stiffed by the Midland Railway Company, but then he worked the rest of his life to pay off those people. And Frank, as a 17-year-old, got a contract with the Ministry of Natural Resources of its day to salvage logs off the bottom near Longford Mills, in and around Aurelia, including the Narrows, and also up at French River. And he told me the story how he had a whole trailer load of lumber stolen by one of the truckers one day, and there's no way he could get it back. So he went on to better things after that. Many of you know him to be a strong advocate in the community for things like the Aurelia Water, Light and Power, which I agree with him on. The other aspects of the logging legacy are the Geneva Park, which was part of the Thompson estate. That became a YMCA property, and that's used to attract people. And the temperance laws that came in, and habitat restoration. So my grandfather became he was a hunter, but he became a keen conservationist as well. So that helped out. Cedar Island, of course, because that's a local landmark. So one of the things I like to do is try and point out features in your community you can go visit afterwards. I'd highly recommend you take a little drive out to Cedar Island and contemplate how it's mostly all filled in with sawdust. There's also the diversification of the industry, as I discussed, and the transportation, including railways, the navigation, and the railway trams. And then the other aspect, which isn't so nice, is although a lot of Chippewas and Métis people in my family did okay economically, there were a lot that probably didn't do okay because it was such a stress on the community. And the Williams Treaty was a betrayal, I believe, of the Chippewas, leading to years of poverty for many. So, and then the lasting social structure in the end. But by the way, I'm really glad that as a compensation in a way, the casino came to town, at least to help to restore the balance, the economic balance that logging took from them, probably, largely. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to thank Frank Keogh, my cousin, Joe Jessel, my cousin, for help, Rick McNamee, who's married to my cousins and whose wife, Marg Keogh, is a distant cousin of his, and to the Aurelia Museum of Art History, and all those people I consulted on this, including the society, to help me with this presentation. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. We really appreciate you being here with us this evening and sharing your wealth of research with us. So folks, I'm going to hand it over to Trish in a couple of minutes, who will wrap it up for us and give us a preview as to some of the upcoming presentations this year. But before we do that, we are going to do a little Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A space, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pose them to John to answer. And we have actually had a few questions coming in and some comments as well, thanking you for your presentation, John. But we do have a few questions. So Kay has asked one that I also wondered, which was what powered the log tram that you showed the picture of so that it can move logs at 2 miles an hour?
Oh, that's a good question. Solar power. No, I'm sorry, I don't know, but I would assume steam, because it seemed back then it was either steam or water power. And since there wasn't a fast flowing source of water there, I would assume it would have been steam.
Okay. Deanne is asking, your presentation included stories of your family and the fact that they shared stories with you. Is this where your interest in history comes from?
I think my interest in history comes from that and my dad, who was a history teacher. And as a young person, they would drive us around the country, and they'd often stop at these historical plaques where we could play and listen to them tell the story. So yeah, from both sides. But as people know, like Indigenous people love to share family stories. So there is a lot of storytelling going on. And the one thing about the Goodores is they always remember what their family history was. We lost contact, we lost an understanding exactly until more recently how we were related to the Shillings on the Rama Reserve there, the Shilling family. But that didn't matter because we all knew we had a common ancestor. So that made it easy. So successive generations have been friends with one another without knowing. But now we know exactly how that tree was built. So that is also interesting. The fact that both sides of the family have told me that they were aware that we were connected and that we were part of family. And having worked on the landscape of Aurelia as a real estate appraiser, driving all over the countryside, just knowing that the soil is littered with the bones of your ancestors, literally, because I know some of the farm boys used to dig up the bones of the burial bones and they grind them up into fertilizer and scatter them all over the place. That's actually very realistic understanding of the landscape.
We have Janet who asks, are you familiar with the Pedwell Lumber Company?
No, I'm not, because I tell you, there were hundreds of different companies all over the place. It was just mind-boggling. So I had to focus it in on the themes that I wanted to bring out in this one. Mm-hmm. But there are some really good books on it. And I think actually there's a really good book called Mills and Mill Villages. I think I might have bought this at the museum even. And that's a really good one for Severn, but I wasn't able to find if there's a book dealing with Aurelia's lumber trade or logging industry. So it may be a book for someone to write.
We do have some logging books in our gift shop now that you mention it at the museum, including one on Longford Mills, so worth checking out.
Cool.
We have a couple of comments. Peter's left a couple of comments in the Q&A section actually discussing some of the financial points that you brought up. So if folks are interested there, Peter has left a link for us actually so that we can explore the financial elements of this further, which is fascinating. So thank you, Peter, for sharing that. Besides that, we just have a couple of comments. John, thanking you for your work, and one in particular, which I absolutely agree with, says, I love the way you include anecdotes from your family in your talk. I've learned to see Aurelia and its surrounds a little differently. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
And yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it off for this evening. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, of course, to you, John. And we will pass it off to Trish now to wrap things up for us.
Hello, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone in the audience tonight for your ongoing support of the speaker series and the museum. I do want to say a special thank you for John for returning as a special guest for us this evening and sharing your wealth knowledge the logging industry in Aurelia and area. And what I personally appreciated, and by the sounds that a number of our audience did, as well as the personal anecdotes, but also the visuals you shared, the sketches of Aurelia back in the day and the impact of the clearing, I thought was a really nice touch to the presentation. So thank you for finding those for us and sharing them with us. That was great. We will be sending out the survey. I'm mentioning it because we do love hearing it from you after these presentations on what you liked, what you'd like to see something different. And there is going to be a draw in April for our first winners of some OMAH swag for all those who respond to our survey. So please fill it out and let us know how we're doing. Coming up, we've got some more great speakers. April 20th, we have Judy Humphreys, who's the head of the Gravenhurst Archives, who will speak on the Canadian government's operated prisoner of war camp. It was called Camp 20. It was located a few miles away in Gravenhurst between 1940 and 1946. And she will share the history of that camp along with the perks that some German POWs had. They received university courses, they got musical instruments to create a symphony and orchestra. So sounds like a very fascinating talk, so please join us then. And then in May, we have speaker Charlie Ellens, who will share the history of the Trent Severn Waterway, which is a National Historic Site right in our own backyard on the Severn River. It's where the Severn River, Lake Couchiching, and Georgian Bay merge together. It took 90 years to build. It's a very scenic, meandering canal, and it's been referred to as one of the finest interconnected systems of navigation in the world. So we hope you can join us for our upcoming talks. Thank you, John, and thank you all, and have a good night.